This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Auric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
This is the arms, or these are the arms of the province of Munster, the southernmost part of Ireland. We hope you're going to enjoy your trip to Munster today. It's a very interesting and very delightful place, a place with many deep indented bays, and of course a place that has Blarney and Killarney, and since you know those so well, perhaps we shouldn't delay your flight there. We'll take you there in a jiffy, if you'll just fasten your seatbelt and move along with us on the airlines. We'll be there. Now, we'll begin our trip possibly by looking at something that you're bound to see, some of the traveling people along the countryside. These people are to be found particularly in the south and the west of the country, but you will find them in other sections too. They like to call themselves the traveling people, and visitors sometimes call them tinkers, because this is what they're known as locally. You might like to know that you can hire a caravan and join them. It's becoming fairly popular to do this. Some of the tinker women are reputedly very beautiful, and certainly she seems to qualify. Well, you'll see them along the road, but when you have landed at the airport, it would perhaps be natural for you first to go to this city, the city of Limerick, the nearest large city to the airport, a very progressive town. You know, the Gaelic word Limerick means a bare spot, but these people seem to have made it anything but. It has these delightful Georgian streets. These were, in the 18th century, these were put up about the time that the town walls were dismantled. It's a very historic city, and this view of the Thomond Bridge, for instance, and King John's Castle, the bridge at the extreme left, and you may better be able to see it now, a bridge on which the famous treaty stone rests. And there's a long story in connection with that, and I think maybe you better ask when you get there. This was all O'Donovan territory until the 12th century when the Fitzgeralds took over. But it's the birthplace of people like Gerald Griffin, the Irish novelist, and Kate O'Brien, the modern novelist. And only a few miles away, you have this charming lake, Loch Gur. There's a most extraordinary collection of antiquities around the shores of this lake, going back to the Stone Age settlements. And it's an entrancing place, even in its own modern right. And if you're very lucky, you may see Gerald, the Earl of Kildare, who disappeared centuries ago and sleeps beneath the waters of this lake every 7th year to come forth and ride around on a silver-shod steed. And also, in this lovely county of Limerick, we have the ruins of the O'Donovan home, later the Fitzgerald Castle. But this was the O'Donovan Castle in the 14th century and purchased in the 18th by the Quinns. We are in Adair with the beautiful thatched cottages. Perhaps no place in Ireland will you see lovelier thatched cottages than in Adair in Limerick. And as you leave in the evening and see some of the streets here with their evening shadows, you would pass out perhaps along the Shannon, the town of Foynes. But eventually we're leaving Limerick and going to the coastal county of Clare, where Clare cottages and stone walls introduce us to what is called the Banner County, the only county of Munster which is north of the Shannon. All the others are to the south. And this is McNamara and O'Brien country. In fact, this at Bunratty is once a residence of the O'Briens, Bunratty Castle. Notice how these castles dominate rivers. And this castle, which was once the residence of the O'Briens, was probably built by a McNamara at the beginning of the 15th century. It was in the hands of the English for a good while, and it might interest you to know that in 1645, the English commander of this castle, this is really only the keep of the castle, but it's the only thing standing. In 1645, the English commander was Admiral William Penn, the father of our William Penn of Pennsylvania. And a visitor to these shores in 1646, a papal nuncio, wrote home, "In Italy there is nothing like the palace and grounds of the Lord Thomond," he was an O'Brien who lived here, "nothing like its ponds and park with its 3,000 head of deer. It's now an open museum restored for visitors. You might get there. But here is an O'Brien castle which is not in readiness for visitors. In the Kilfenora district, this has an interesting tale. During the Cromwellian Wars, Conor O'Brien, who was the man of this house, was killed. He was married to a very resourceful woman, Moira Rowe McMahon. And when her husband was brought home dead by the English soldiery, she said, "There's no room in this house for a corpse." And while that might seem quite cold to us, she was a very shrewd woman. She told the English general, General Ludlow, that she would marry anyone whom he selected, any of his officers, who soon became her officer. And she married a cooper, and thus saved the estates from leaving her own family, and they descended to her son. And from her, really, the McNamaras and O'Briens of this area descend. But Clare is an interesting county, and especially along its ocean front, with these huge cliffs rising as much as 650 feet above the ocean, with an O'Brien castle on the top there. It's a favorite spot for visitors and photographers. It has its dangers, of course, because one can be blown off the top by the winds. You are now on the edge of the Atlantic, and there's no point in playing it anything but safe. And as you pass through the southern part of Ireland in Munster, you're going to see many a fair. They are not, of course, limited to Munster by any means, but there's something perhaps that the visitor has to understand, because so many visitors come from an urban background in America, and a little bit difficult for them to understand the ways of farmers anywhere. Now, when you see one of these fairs, you're going to find the streets will be crowded with cattle, with sheep, perhaps with pigs in a pen, and naturally there are going to be signs of animal life around. The streets have to be hosed down after the fair is over. And for some people, you know, who are just a bit too dainty, all of this is just dreadful. But actually, of course, this is the lifeblood of any civilization. After all, where would we be but for our farmers? And since Ireland, north, south, east, and west, is an agricultural country chiefly, well, you must expect to find signs of it. You know, I do remember meeting a very, very dainty woman some years ago who, on a visit to our particular place, at the time that we were spreading some commercial fertilizer over the lawn, she said, "Oh, she so much preferred that to, you know, the natural manure." So when you go to the fairs, please understand that you are visiting an agricultural country, and you are seeing part of the economy, and it's part of the charm. You will see them all over. So we've opened with a few sites that you'll see, the tinkers along the roadside, these sturdy, independent people who want to live their own lives, and also the farm fairs, as well as some of the scenic sites around Limerick and Clare. Now we're going into a rather fabled country. We're going to cross the Shannon and go to Kerry. Kerry, you know, as the home of Killarney, which has been visited by everybody and his uncle. But I'd like to say there's more to Kerry than just Killarney. It's unfortunate that always one or two spots monopolize our attention, and America becomes nothing but the Statue of Liberty, and Ireland becomes nothing but Killarney. Killarney is beautiful and it's interesting. And I might say, you remember Baron Munchausen? His creator, the German academic in the 18th century who created him, happened to have died at Killarney, by the way. Well, we'll move along into Kerry now, and out on the Dingle Peninsula, I think we'll start, a very charming place. This is Brandon Mountain. Brendan, really. It's Brandon Mountain, Clochan Village. This is the second highest mountain in Ireland, but that's beside the point. This is a charming little area. You see the man returning from the creamery with his donkey and cart, or his ass and cart, as it will be referred to in Ireland, taking home the empty jugs that have transported his milk to the creamery. This is a phenomenally rich place in antiquities of all kinds, and it's off the beaten path enough so that I think you will enjoy a visit there. All of this country is rich in remains like this Aum stone, for instance. This is easily 1,500 or more years old, and reminds us, of course, of the antiquity of Irish civilization. But there are Christian antiquities in this area too. And this illustration of an Irish church that's well over 1,000 years old, made in the ancient Irish fashion, unmortared stone, and it's still dry today after no care at all through all these years. Notice it's an inverted boat. This is the shape of the early Irish churches, and in your travels around Ireland you might see some others. This is at Gallerus on the Dingle Peninsula, which is where we are now. The coastal scenery is magnificent. This is Slay Head, right at the head of Dingle Bay. And it's across the peninsula from a very pretty place called Smerwick Harbor, which is remembered for a tremendous slaughter of Spaniards and Italians. In the year 1580, the English forces just simply put to death a garrison of Spaniards and Italians who had been defending this place for the Irish, put them to death, all except the officers. I guess it amounted to something to be an officer in those days. You were too good to be killed in cold blood. Now, as we leave that peninsula, we come in toward Tralee. Here is a place called Banna Strand. Beautiful, miles upon miles of sugar-fine white sand without any ice cream vendors or anything of the sort. But in modern history, we know this is the place where Roger Casement landed in 1916. Remember, he was one of the men who was implicated, if this is choosing the word well, in the 1916 revolution. And we move into the town itself of Tralee, where we're joining now, the peninsula is joining the mainland, as it were, and we check through the streets, and here is a 60-minute cleaner. Notice the latest thing in cleaning, and one of the older forms of transportation right with it. So now we're on the road to Killarney, and here indeed at Killarney's lakes, with its fantastic accumulations of clouds and mountains and water, and here are the Irish sidecars which will take you around. The upper lake, nestling in the mountains, is often held to be the most charming, and I believe, I'm speaking from memory, but I think it was of this area that Tennyson wrote his poem, "The splendor falls on castle walls and snowy summits old in story. The long light shakes across the lakes, and the wild cataract leaps in glory. Blow, bugle, blow, set the wild echoes flying. Blow, bugle, answer echoes, dying, dying, dying." And the reason for that is, as you pass through these lakes, the boatman will blow his bugle as you pass a wooded height called Eagle's Nest, and the answering echoes are very interesting indeed. The mountains add something in the way of attraction and also something in the way of a disadvantage, because Killarney can be quite rainy because the mountains which ring it around often cause these clouds to empty. And here the lower lake, which is the largest, 5,000 acres of it, has over 30 islands, and of course it's filled with legends. O'Donoghue territory. One of the islands in there is Innisfallen. It's one of the loveliest. This is a 19th century woodcut of the beauties of Innisfallen Island in that lake. The ruins of this abbey date back to 600, and the annals of Innisfallen, which are now in the Bodleian Library, were written here in the 10th and 11th centuries and even later. And at the end we have Ross Castle, a 14th century keep, the principal residence of the O'Donohues in that time, and the last place in Munster to be captured by the Cromwellians. Now, before one leaves Killarney, he ought to do more than just look at the pretty sights of nature. He ought to visit the monument to the Irish poets, which you will find in the town. Well, we won't visit it today, but that's just a reminder. We go on to Kenmare, at the head of another bay, and generally people who go to Killarney visit Kenmare. They drive around what is called the Ring of Kerry, and this would be a part of it. Notice the palms. There's a great deal of subtropical vegetation in this part of the country because even the winters average, say, 50 or better, 50 degrees Fahrenheit or better. This is one of the warmest spots in Ireland. And adjoining this is a place called Parknasilla. The winters, I think, are even warmer. The original of the Father O'Flynn portrait lived in this neighborhood, a Father Michael Walsh. Some of you may know that poem about Father O'Flynn, the charming priest who was so full of learning and gaiety and so on. Now we cross the divide into an extraordinarily attractive place. We're in County Cork now, and here is Gugan Barra, a deep mountain tarn. Notice the way the mountains hem it in. This is the source of the River Lee. And after a rainfall, the rain pouring off those mountains just comes down in mists and hundreds of little cataracts. And in the middle of this is an island also, St. Finbarr's Island. And this 19th century etching of it will illustrate for you some of the romantic appeal of this section. Natives, that is, the Irish themselves, and visitors all comment on the beauties of Gugan Barra in Cork, on our way to Cork from Killarney. And then we continue our journey. We come to that extraordinarily attractive bay at Glengariff, an island-studded bay. We're in the territory of the O'Driscolls, the O'Mahanys, and indeed of all beautiful lovers of beauty, rather. Thackeray wrote of this in the 19th century, "Were such a bay lying upon English shore, it would be a world's wonder." Well, we continue our journey, and we might be so lucky as to meet an Irish colleen on the road by the furze bushes. These furze bushes in the southern part are likely to be in bloom even in January. So we'll say goodbye to our charming colleen and continue now to one of the most fateful places in Irish history. This is Kinsale. I should say that with a great deal of drama, really. The whole fate of Ireland hung upon the Battle of Kinsale, upon one battle. So the historian Curtis writes. And this is King Charles's fort. But we're not concerned so much with the fort, perhaps, as with the greater history of the battles fought here. when the Spaniards came to the rescue of the hard-pressed Elizabethan Irish, they foolishly landed here in Kinsale at the very south of Ireland, whereas the Irish needed them in the north. And they forced the Irish then to march the whole length of the island, which the Irish did. And still then mistakes were made both by Spanish and Irish, and the battle was lost after that great heroic march. And here is an example of the famous hooded cloak that one may still occasionally see at Kinsale here. Kinsale, of course, is a fishing town, as so many of these coastal towns are, and you will find plenty of copy for your camera by the seaside. Now we move to Blarney, and who hasn't heard of Blarney? The 15th century McCarthy Castle. Reputedly, if one can trust the story, the word came into the language because of Queen Elizabeth's exasperation with the McCarthy lord of this castle. Elizabeth was anxious to get her hands upon it and a lot of the lands around here, and he was just as anxious to delay her, which he did in such a charming way that he carried the day, but he exasperated her with his Blarney. And now, to the center of it all, to Cork City. Cork, you know, is Ireland's Texas, the largest county in Ireland, and in many ways one of the most charming. And certainly this is a charming, lively city. This is St. Finbarr's Cathedral, the Protestant cathedral, in Cork, on the River Lee. And Edmund Spenser, our famous English Renaissance poet, wrote of the Lee, "The spreading Lee that like an island fair encloseth Cork with his divided flood." And there is that lovely Lee going right through the city. And Spenser, we think, was married in that church you saw a little while ago. Not exactly the same church. I think that was built in the early 19th century, but with its predecessor. Also in Cork City, we have the famous bells of Shandon. The very name Shandon is a Gaelic, it's an anglicized form of a Gaelic name, Shandoon, which means old fort. And as we pass out of Cork City and up the coast to Youghal, we have this extraordinary structure, the Clock Gate. Now, this was, what's his name? Sir Walter Raleigh's town. Sir Walter Raleigh was mayor in this town. He was given a grant of 42,000 acres, and that's nice to come by, provided he could take it and hold it from the people who really owned it. Well, he succeeded in doing this, and he settled in this town, and in this town of Youghal, he probably, well, I think we know he planted the first potato that was ever planted in Ireland, and he probably smoked the first pipe that was ever smoked in Ireland. Now, that town of Youghal, in our time, was the scene of the filming of part of John Huston's Moby Dick. Now, we've gone through almost all of the southern counties on this very, very quick trip. Tried to give you an idea of a few of the tourist spots and a few of the not-so-tourist spots. We must now go to Waterford and Tipperary and try to continue the same there. Waterford, again, a coastal area, has its fishermen and its seaside places. We won't dwell too much on those since you've already seen some examples of them. This imposing castle is in the attractive town of Lismore, built by King John before he was king, built in 1185 and presented to our friend Sir Walter Raleigh. Then, not very far away, we do have an idea of the coastal scenery. This is at Dunmore East, but we ought to go to the main town, Waterford proper. On the river Suir or Sure, Spenser again wrote about the gentle Sure, urbs intacta manat Waterfordia. The intact city, Waterford, remains, an honor conferred indeed by Henry VII on Waterford for its loyalty to him. The harbor here is as attractive now as it was in the days when that print was made, and it is yet it yet carries signs of its antiquity. This Reginald's Tower on the left was a Danish structure built in 1003. One of the most famous of the sons of Waterford is Luke Wadding, the great founder of the Irish College in Rome. And now we cross the borders into Tipperary, and here the Rock of Cashel, which has been the seat of Munster kings since 370 A.D., 1,000 years before Columbus came to America. And on its heights, we find a very interesting example of Irish Romanesque architecture in Cormac's Chapel, built by King Cormac MacCarthy. But the whole mount here is covered with antiquities, this round tower from the 10th century, and the ruins of a 13th century cathedral, and a most unusual cross on the exterior, St. Patrick's Cross, out on the side, commanding a view of the plain. And only 4 miles away, we have this beautiful relic of the Holy Cross Abbey, a Benedictine establishment in the 12th century, became one of the most popular pilgrimage sites in Ireland. And then in Tipperary, we have such lovely plains country. Here is the Glen of Aherlow, 8 miles long, 2 miles wide, a great refuge of Irish rebels in days gone by. And continuing that sort of plains experience, here we have a view of the central plain at the town of Clonmel. This is the town itself in that lovely sylvan setting. Clonmel in Irish, Clúin means the plain of honey, and I think it looks it. Lawrence Sterne, the British novelist, was born here. And in Waterford, one can find such examples as this of the survival of ancient customs. Here is St. Declan's Well. If you're looking for the name of a child, how about Declan, D-E-C-L-A-N, the famous saint of Waterford. And possibly it's time to close the tour by going back in the direction from which we came. We'll return now to the Shannon, and this is Loch Derg on the Shannon. The Shannon has several large lakes, and this happens to be the largest of them. I think it's about 25 miles long. It varies in its width, of course. Loch Derg, where Tipperary meets the Shannon, and 3 counties meet, and the waters spread out with little islands, with gently rolling hills, and the rather slow-moving Shannon at this point. We began near the Shannon when we landed at Shannon, and we circled and went into Limerick, and then we went out and circled the west coast, down along the south coast, and then came up along the east coast on which we have Waterford, in then to Tipperary to join the Shannon again. Munster then is filled with scenic attractions, as is the rest of Ireland, filled with antiquities, as is the rest of Ireland, filled with delightful peace, a lovely place for you to go.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA-TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.